This is RELS 100. We're looking today at Christianity, and I want to finalize the formation of the New Testament, what's called the New Testament canon, with a few more notes on that process. So I talked a little bit about the Gospels last time, how Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John came together and were finalized. And now I'd like to look at the development of what's called the canon. In the Oxford Companion to the Bible, the article on canon says this. From the 4th century CE, the word canon, from a Greek word meaning a rule, has been used to denote the correct list of the biblical books, and in consequence, the collection of books thus listed. It is important to distinguish between the composition of the biblical books and their recognition as scripture. So in my lectures, I've been highlighting that, along with the consensus of most scholars, that the New Testament books were written by the end of the 1st century CE, sometime around 95, I think. The last book's probably the Gospel of John and its final composition, the 4th Gospel, and the book of Revelation. But then the article continues. If we may judge from the history of the New Testament canon, some books were probably recognized as having divine authority more slowly than others. So as I said, the last books were written by 100 of the Common Era, 100 AD, if you're used to that nomenclature, as it were. But it wasn't until about 140 of the Common Era that Marcion, who's known as a great heretic and who strayed from orthodoxy, created a list of scriptures. So this was a church, or really an assembly, a group of the early Christian movement that were meeting in various parts throughout the ancient Near Eastern world. We've already talked about how the dispersion after the destruction of the temple meant the dispersion of Jewish people overall, and especially those Jews also who were Christians, especially relevant for this particular topic. So there wasn't one central location to get the documents. So it was a little bit slow to come together as a list, but Marcion drew up this list at about 140. Ironically, again, a Hesiarch, as it's called, a heretic. The Muratonian canon in 190 lists many of the books that are now in the New Testament. So that was one of the original lists that was incredibly important. But it was really around 250 to 300, that is the 3rd century, that Origen and Eusebius wrote together the lists which are close to the current New Testament. Origen spoke, for example, of the 4 Gospels that we have now as, quote, the only undisputed ones in the whole Church of God throughout the whole world. There were some books that were disputed, the book of James, which seemed to teach something about perhaps being saved by our works, if you reread that, as opposed to salvation by the grace of God. That was one of the problems with that. Even all the way into the 1500s, Martin Luther had some issues with the book of James, for what that's worth. The book of Revelation was also disputed for a while. And there are also some non-New Testament books, now books that aren't included in today's New Testament, like the Shepherd of Hermas, which you probably haven't heard of, but you're welcome, if you're interested, to look that up and see how that connects with what you've read perhaps in the New Testament. At any rate, the books that now comprise the New Testament were drawn up in a letter by the leader, the Bishop Athanasius, in 367 of the Common Era. And there's an icon, as you can see to the right, of his holding that letter. It's the famous Paschal letter, the letter around Easter of Athanasius from Alexandria. So he wanted to, after we're going to see that around in 325, Christianity becomes a legal religion, becomes a religion of the Emperor of Rome, and so there's a need to figure out, well, how do we, now that everybody in Rome is supposed to at least, that Christianity is legal, it doesn't become the official religion until 381, but still, at this point, Christianity is taking on a new role, and so there needs to be, a way in which those documents are, identified. And so they are with Athanasius. Now, here's the big question, of course, why were the texts chosen? I'm going to continue from this article by André Dutoit or Detroit from the Oxford Companion to the Bible. He talks about the criteria of canonicity. Isn't that a great little phrase? Criteria of canonicity. In determining the content and scope of the canon, various criteria were applied. For example, that of apostolicity, the rule of faith, regula fide is the Latin that's often used, and the consensus of all the churches. So you can see that that's listed there. One of my own teachers in my master's at Princeton, Bruce Metzger, this is a list he also drew up in his book on the canon of Scripture. It would be a mistake, however, to deduce from these that apostolicity was, at least initially, treated as a merely formal criterion. Okay, that sentence needs to be unfolded. So apostolicity is the idea that it was understood, a letter or a writing or a gospel was understood to be connected to one of the apostles, one of the early Christian leaders. So the book of John would have been written by the apostle John, or the letters of Paul written by Paul. What the writer is saying is that wasn't just a formal thing. That was actually more important than formal. For example, the Muratorian canon, the real consideration was that of reliability. As primary sources, the apostles and their followers were seen as the trustworthy exponents of the original revelation given in Jesus Christ. So in other words, Jesus was seen as then speaking through these documents. It would be also a mistake to regard the official recognition of our present 27 books by the church as the act which gave them their status as canon. The decisions of the church were in reality the acknowledgement of the intrinsic authority and power of these writings. So what he's getting at there is, I think we often hear today as well, the establishment of what is the canon was this kind of authoritative, sometimes presented as a patriarchal decision to squash dissent in the church. And I'm going to get into that in the next lecture with one or two of the writings that weren't included, and why not. But what is being argued here is that these three criteria were the reasons that the books were included. They were seen to conform to the rule of faith. Particularly were they coherent with the revelation to Israel that we know as the Old Testament or the Tanakh. Was there a continuity? So when Marcion drew up his list, he wanted to demonstrate that the teaching, the good news, the gospel of Jesus was in distinction from the Hebrew Bible. Here, orthodoxy meant that it conformed to the rule of faith. Again, was it connected to the apostles? And today, scholarly consensus is that some of the books with the apostles' names on them, as mentioned, some of the letters of Paul, for example, the book of Revelation was John the Elder, probably not John the Apostle. So there's a concern, perhaps, that apostolicity shouldn't be taken in some like the apostles literally authored these texts, but they were connected with the apostles and their witness. And then the consensus. So this is important that the churches or the assemblies, the Christian communities all throughout in Israel or Palestine, Levant, in Asia Minor, which is Turkey today, and there in Rome and Greece and so on, that it wasn't just a local assembly that accepted these letters as authoritative, but all of them did. That was part of why the texts were chosen. All right, I want to close with what Irenaeus said, one of the leading Christian, one of the Christian leaders from the 2nd century. Quote, "We have known the method of our salvation by no other means than those by whom the gospel came to us, which gospel they preached." In other words, we first heard it from the people who actually preached it, but afterward, by the will of God, they delivered to us in the scriptures to be for the future the foundation and pillar of our faith. So Irenaeus is saying, first it was preached orally, but now the Bible, and is particularly these scriptures held to be authoritative. This is the foundation and pillar of faith. That's the way that the early Christian movement understood these texts.